Chat? Can y'all hear me? Testing? Uh-oh, GG. No, it's working. How's everybody doing today? So, welcome to another Healthy Gamer GG stream. My name is Alok Kanoja. I'm a psychiatrist practicing in Boston. Just a reminder that everything we discuss today on stream is intended to be for educational purposes only, and nothing is intended to be taken as medical advice. So a couple of just random orienting things. So for those of you that don't know, I'm in the EU, and I'm at the International with Evil Geniuses. So the schedule is like all over the place. So like I'm supposed to be here, helping them with like mindset and performance, which has been an absolute blast, very educational, has been really cool. But my schedule is like all over the place. So I'm trying to find, odd hours where there isn't anything going on, to try to check in with y'all, see how everybody's doing, maybe continue to do some of the stuff that we do at HG. But at least between now and October 20th, things are going to be like all over the place. So I'll try to stream in random, times and places. It's like a pop-up stream kind of thing where there's like normally, my team really helps, or the HG team really helps me like stay organized and, lets y'all know when and where we're going to be doing what. Unfortunately, for the next few weeks, like it's not going to be like that. So, things like scrims get canceled, like we get quarantined, PCR tests are delayed. So like all kinds of random stuff happens, and like it's hard to plan for. So at the end of the day, though, I love streaming. I miss y'all. So we got, we're just gonna have to see how things are. So stay, yeah, it's a breakfast stream, absolutely. So it's 10:20 my time, local time in Romania. I think just to give you guys a couple of updates. So like TI is super cool. It's been amazing to be able to like work with the players, and I also like, run into people. I think it's kind of weird. Like there's like a very like oppressive kind of atmosphere this year. It feels like I think people are pretty disappointed that there like isn't going to be a crowd. And also with all the COVID stuff and things like that, people can't quite like socialize and have fun. So I see people like, interacting with each other from a distance and stuff like that, but you can't just like hang out and chill with other people, especially other teams. So people are kind of like sticking with their team and stuff like that. Thanks for the gifted subs, Zero and A. But so it's been cool, like, but also, I think everyone's just a little bit bummed. So for example, normally like family and stuff will come will come. So to try to support players during, this awesome, intense esports competition. And unfortunately, like all of that got canceled. So like people's girlfriends aren't coming, people's parents aren't coming, and all that kind of stuff. So it's like a little bit challenging, a little bit sad. So the actual competition starts in about 48 hours. So group stages start in 2 days. So I think everyone's just kind of buckling down and preparing. But it's not quite as, I get the impression from talking to other people that in other years, because of like COVID and because of the absence of COVID, things were a little bit more lighthearted and enjoyable. But generally speaking, people I think are just focusing on the game and focusing on prep and stuff like that. So it's been really cool. It's also been interesting for me because I think in some ways this year actually feels like less fun. So I feel like it's really educational, and I feel really good about the work that I'm doing. But it also kind of occurs to me that like I'm part of what has made TI fun in previous years is that I was like rooting for multiple teams. Like I was happy to see, underdogs do well. I was happy to see like, some teams like doing like, you can support multiple teams. You like multiple players. Players will like move around and stuff like that, right? So if you like one team like 3 years ago and you really like all their players, and then the team disbands and people move around, you're still like rooting for all those players like as they move to different teams, right? And there are some really, really hype matches between two good teams, and even if you're not necessarily rooting for any of them, it's like it's going to be a good match, and so it's like very exciting to watch, and like no matter who wins, like it's great. This year, however, I feel like this weird, it's sort of like I'm clearly like rooting for just one team, so like there's one team that I want to win. There's one team I'm invested in. The thought of losing hurts way more. The thought of winning is far more important. Whereas I had the luxury of some amount of detachment when watching like previous TIs. Like, sure, I had my favorites and stuff like that, but it's not, you know, so that kind of feels kind of weird. It reminds me of something that our Discord mods once told me. And even like I've heard from streamers and stuff like that. Like, so, you know, Twitch is like a fun place that you can hang out and do things unless you're a streamer. And it's the same for like Discord mods on our server. Like, you know, the server is the HG Discord server is like a lot of fun to hang out, right? Except if you're a mod, because then suddenly like becoming a mod, like you can't be a participant in the community. You can't be like a regular participant once you're, you know, like invested in some way. And that's what I kind of feel that even with esports now is like I'm invested in some way, so I can't just like take a step back and just enjoy it the way that everyone else gets to. I've never really understood that, even on Twitch and stuff, because I'm a streamer, but like I do a lot of other stuff. So it's interesting because I'll talk to some streamers who just don't, you know, when they show up in someone's chat and are just vibing with everyone else, like people like notice it and things like that. So, yeah, so do you think the lack of crowd will have a big effect on the player's mentality or performance? So that's kind of interesting. So after talking to a bunch of people who are actually professionals, I think some teams perform better in front of a crowd and some teams perform worse. So some teams are like better at like in online tournaments and they tend to perform worse on LANs, and other teams are stronger, like they don't do quite as well online and like they kind of feed off of the energy of the crowd. So we'll see. I think we'll see. It's a good question. So yeah, for those of y'all that are, for those of y'all that are in the EU or Asia, it's nice to see y'all during the daytime and light. So I think, yeah, so it's good to see you guys. I'm doing well. So I think, because I don't really know what else to do. Like we've got a bunch of like subreddit posts to catch up on. So I think we're going to just take a quick look at some of those. Let me just make sure. Shouldn't you try to detach to get optimal performance? Sure, you should try to. But so actually, I think optimal performance is not attained through complete detachment. Optimal performance is actually attained through eustress. So everyone's familiar with the term distress, right? Which means like when the stress level that you have is so high that it negatively impacts your performance. But if you really look at the research, what the research shows is that there's a window of what they call eustress. Eu meaning like good, like the Latin prefix for good. It's the opposite of dis. So if you kind of think about it, like if things are not stressful at all, like they're kind of so chill, like you actually don't, you're kind of like AFK, right? It's sort of like easy mode, and so you don't actually play your best when things are like super easy. So for example, like if I'm playing chess against a 3-year-old, like I'm actually not going to play the best chess of my life. Like it's just not going to happen. Because the 3-year-old doesn't even know how to play, so I'm not going to like perform at my highest level. Versus if I'm, playing chess against like the Grandmaster, like I don't know if you guys have seen that, that Dark Souls boss clip of the kid with playing against the chess master, and then you get into distress. So when the stress level is too high, you don't perform optimally. But if you kind of look at like the way, let's say like you're playing a video game and you're up against the final boss, like I'm thinking about once again Dark Souls, where there's a certain amount of like focus that comes from like a certain amount of stress that actually leads to optimal performance. It is similar to the flow state. So the flow state is not achieved through like complete relaxation. It's achieved through a period of a window of eustress. So a lot of my work is helping people like maintain that window. So, it's interesting because if people get overconfident, they like start to make mistakes. And if they feel intimidated, they start to make mistakes. So how can you help people attain a level of like confidence, but still respecting their opponent so they stay in that eustress zone and maintain the flow state? So for example, this was months ago, not so much this work now, but I was working with some people who felt intimidated. And when they felt intimidated, what they would do is like their ego would activate, right? And then they would start like kind of crapping on or like downplaying the other team's skill. Like they would say things like, oh, they're not that good. We can beat them. They think they're hot stuff, but they're not really that great. Like we're just as good. Like it's this kind of egotistical, I'm better than you or you're not better than me kind of talk, which is actually like not optimal. So what you actually want to do in those kinds of situations for optimal performance is you want to acknowledge and respect the power differential and then have confidence in yourself that you've still got a chance to win. So it's okay to say, I think actually the optimal performance comes when you say, okay, I only have a 30% chance of winning this game. The deck is stacked against me, but I do have a 30% chance of winning. So how can I capitalize on it? How can I take this rigged game that is not in my favor and still play to the best of my ability and win? I don't want to get intimidated. It's not 0% and it's not 50%. Because then the problem is if you psych yourself up from an ego standpoint, you say like, oh, I'm just as good as they are. And then you go into the game and like something doesn't go your way, like all of that comes crumbling down, right? So actually what you want to do is like respect your opponent, acknowledge that you're at a disadvantage, and then find like some degree of like confidence or a ray of hope to recognize that you can still win the game. And when I teach people this kind of stuff, it's not just in esports. Like other good examples are like promotions. So sometimes someone will be applying for a promotion and someone else, they'll say like, oh, this other candidate is actually better than I am. And so if you kind of acknowledge that and you kind of go in knowing you're at a disadvantage, you can actually perform and win. Because the other person on the flip side who doesn't have that kind of attitude will be like, oh, I am better than this person. Easy clap, right? So they're going to kind of go in overconfident and they're not going to try as hard. And then like on the flip side, you've got someone else who acknowledges their weaknesses, but is also giving 100%. And so when it comes down to the actual interview, like one person kind of feels like they've already got the job because they've got A, B, and C, and then their uncle started the company. And then you've got someone else who clearly is like hungry for it, is going to try, is going to like put forth their best foot. And you'd be surprised at, how that shakes out. So I think that a lot of this stuff, it's tricky. Like finding the right level of detachment is really important. So, all right, let's take a quick look at Subreddit. Okay, this is a good one, chat. So how do I stop lusting over a streamer I work for? Hi, Dr. K and chat. I have a crush or lust for a very attractive streamer. I'm leaning more towards lust as most of my thoughts for her are sexual rather than fantasy of being in a relationship. This infatuation has led me to constantly wanting her attention and getting jealous when I don't get it, or she gives it to someone else, such as her boyfriend. I know usually in this situation you step away and distance yourself and use other activities to distract yourself. But I'm her editor, so I'm quite literally exchanging DMs, editing and photoshopping images and videos of her hours every day. It's not something I can just quit or focus less on, as she pays me significantly more than average since she is a successful streamer YouTuber. I mean, sorry for the alt account. Had to use it since a lot of community members would recognize my main account. So let's just kind of quickly review what this post is sort of about. So there's someone who seems like they're a successful YouTube editor or Photoshopper or whatever, they're editor. And they have a work relationship with a very attractive streamer who seems to be female, and they're having kind of lustful thoughts for this person, and they're trying to figure out, how to stop lusting for this person. So there are a couple of important points here to think about. So first of all, this is very common, right? So the first thing to understand is that parasocial relationships are a growing factor in our society. So what I mean by parasocial relationships is, like these like relationships to a certain degree with streamers, YouTubers, etc. But it's not just a parasocial relationship, right? This is like older than that. Like people have been lusting over their work colleagues since, there has been work since the dawn of time. So there are a couple of important points here. The first thing is that, if you're in this situation and you find yourself lusting over someone, the first thing that you need to do is be honest with yourself. So this person is saying, all I experience is lust. I'm not interested in a relationship. But if you really pay attention to some of the posts and stuff like that, it seems like they also feel jealous when said streamer is like spending time with their boyfriend. So it seems like if you really are honest with yourself, there's more there than lust, right? So if you're feeling like jealous or like upset, if this person is doing more than potentially, fucking, then you have to be a little bit careful about that. The second thing to think about is that, if all you feel is lust, jealousy is not necessarily like an appropriate emotion. And what I mean by that is that, like, if all you feel is lust, it shouldn't theoretically matter to you whether, like, this person is engaging in sexual activity with other people, because all you want is sexual activity with the person. So if you, are concerned that this person is, like, having sex with someone else and you don't want that to happen, then the truth is that you probably feel more than just lust. So then the question becomes, like, why is lust the primary thing that you experience? And that's because I think lust is the safest feeling for people in this situation to have, right? Lust is the feeling that is the most justifiable. It's the one that actually hurts the least, right? I'm just horny, like, that's all. It's just like, it's a physical thing. So it's actually like a very protective diagnosis as opposed to I'm in love with this person. So sometimes remember that the mind will tell you a lie to try to protect you. And one of the most common lies that it tells you is like, when you feel like there's no opportunity for you to have a relationship with someone, your mind will tell you, oh, you're just horny, that's it. And because that becomes like a lot more like internally tolerable. So the truth is that you may actually have more feelings for this person than just lust. It's a little bit unclear to me, but I would seriously explore those, and that'll become important in a second because, so the next thing is that unless you really understand how you feel and the spectrum and depth of your feelings, dealing with them is going to be difficult. Because if you diagnose this as a problem of lust and you try to fix a problem of lust, but the truth is that there's like suppressed feelings that go beyond lust, your solutions may not work, right? So if you misdiagnose the problem, you're not going to be able to treat it well. So the first thing that you need to do is be honest with yourself. The next thing that you need to be careful about, so this goes for everyone out there. So a lot of times we know what we need to do, but there's a reason that we can't do it, right? So this person says, I know that the right answer here is to distance myself, but I can't, right? And that's a very, very dangerous way of thinking. So anytime our mind is resistant to something, what it actually does is provides us with a very good logical reason that gives us an excuse to not do what we need to do. So when I really need to do something and I really don't want to do something, my mind will subconsciously give me a really good excuse so that I don't do it, right? And what this person is saying, I'm a successful editor, I get paid above average, and so I can't leave my job, right? I have to stay. Oh, that's too bad that you have to stay. And then internally, some part of you that wants to be closer to this person, that wants to like, there's probably some amount of gratification that this very successful and attractive YouTube streamer is like sending you, like you have such an intimate relationship with them. They rely on you. You're a part of their life. You're responsible for their success. They owe you in some way. You also get to see slices of this person's life that other people don't see. There's a certain intimacy there, right? There's all the plebs who get to see the photoshopped images, and you're the one that gets to see like the real images. So there's a lot of like thoughts there that are kind of interesting. There's a lot of actually intimacy and closeness in the relationship, which there's a part of you that probably doesn't want to give up. And so, because like there's a lot of logical answers here. Even if you get paid above market rate, like if you work with this streamer, and I'm pretty sure you apply for jobs with other streamers, like if you're a successful editor for a successful streamer, that probably allows you to, do that kind of work for other people at a comparable pay. But what I'm sort of noticing in this situation, and this is for all of you guys, is like, if you know what the right answer is, and your mind says, but I can't do it because of this other reason, and it provides some kind of justification, be careful, because that's a sign of resistance. Remember that the mind, when it has a secret desire, and this is where like you have to properly diagnose it, as long as that desire is secret, it will fight against you in terms of like creating some kind of artificial resistance. Maybe this person is right, and maybe they get paid an inappropriate amount, and it is sort of a challenge for them. But that too, I would encourage you to think long and hard. Like just because you get paid less somewhere else doesn't mean that it isn't like a bad idea for you to switch jobs, right? So remember that what you pay for with financial security can sometimes be like mental health or stalling in other parts of your life. Like, sure, you can get paid more if you work 80 hours a week, but is that actually like a trade that you want to make? So the first thing that you need to do is be honest with yourself and recognize, is this just lust or is it more than lust? And the challenge there is that accepting that it's more than lust will probably be more painful, because the actual opportunity for a real relationship may be smaller than like just lust. The second thing to do is be aware of your internal resistance. And if you know what the right answer is and your mind says, but you can't do the right answer because of XYZ, be careful about that. Can you really not do that? Is the resistance really real? Like, that may actually be true, but you can probably still, exert some degree of influence or change or switch your jobs. And the third thing to consider is like space in your life. So oftentimes, the reason that people get stuck in a particular relationship is because they don't create the space in their lives for an alternative. So I'd be really curious whether this person is in a relationship of their own, right? So are you single? Are you in a relationship? This is where we kind of get into issues of like emotional affairs and stuff like that. Or even like, having persistent sexual thoughts about someone who's like outside of who your relationship is with. So I'd really be curious about like the empty spaces of your life. So generally speaking, when we have some emptiness in our life, we tend to fill it in with some kind of like approximation of the real thing, right? This is like one of these like, when I'm super lonely and like I buy like a pillow that's shaped like another human and I cuddle that pillow, it sort of like is an approximation of the real thing, and it can bring me some kind of comfort, but it never really fills up the void. So we also see this in like substance use, right? So when I feel like lonely and bad about myself, I feel like empty on the inside. And so I can seek oblivion through drugs. And like, it'll sort of fill things up kind of, right? So like if let's say I like do a lot of coke and I go to a party and I like have a blast and I get laid and stuff like that. And so like I fill up, the emptiness in my soul with like dopamine and enjoyment and pleasure, but it never truly fills it up. And what I found a lot of times is when we're empty on the inside, it can be really, really hard to actually get rid of the thing that like is holding us back. So when I feel super empty inside, like getting sober is actually the hardest thing. When you feel like very lonely on the inside, sometimes stepping away from some of these like parasocial or work relationships is actually the hardest thing. And this is unfortunate, but we're going to kind of take a quick tangent into like yogic thinking. But anytime we feel empty inside, we try to fill that emptiness through the indriyas or the sense organs. So this is where like if you feel like alone, or you feel, like you're not loved, or that you want a fulfilling relationship, or even if you want to get laid, and you bombard your senses with like images of this particular person, your brain is going to be like, oh, we're empty over here. We're getting all of this like sensory input. Let's try to fill up that input over here. And this is where, if you really want to fill this thing up, you actually have to get rid of like the sensory inputs. So this is where sometimes, people that I'll work with, like they keep on breaking up with each other and then getting back together. And the reason for that is because there's not actually space in their life for a new relationship, right? So when you break up with someone and then you're kind of like then you're broken up, and then you start like texting them again and stuff like that out of habits, and you kind of hang out with them and stuff like that. As long as you're socializing with that person, there's not going to be space in your life for another person. So it's really important to be careful about the way that, you have a void and the way that you fill it up through certain sensory organs or experiences, and try really hard to create the space in your life for someone else to move in. Because what I'm kind of noticing in this situation is that there's like that thoughts of this particular streamer or YouTuber, like you have so much sensory input, they're like entering your life so much that there isn't space for you to like lust after someone else, right? Because all of your lust is already occupied by this person. And as long as your sense organs are being bombarded by these Photoshop images for hours and hours and hours a day, then you're like, that's going to like occupy your lust. So I'd say, and the last thing to kind of think a little bit about is just acceptance and grief. So this is hard, but one of the skills that we're never taught, which I think is one of the most important skills to learn, is how to grieve. So the last thing that this person could do is like grieve this loss. And what do I mean by this loss? It could be the possibility that you'll never have a sexual relationship with this person, so you have to kind of like let that go, like accept, hey, it's never going to happen. The other thing that you could do is grieve the loss of the lack of a true relationship, that you have a professional relationship and that maybe you want more than lust. And you just have to like learn how to grieve, right? Like you can't ignore it. You have to accept that it's there. And this goes back to number one, which is like be honest with yourself and then like grieve it. So you have to like mourn it, right? So you have to like sit there and think about all the things that you want and accept and think about how you're never going to get them. And as you go through that process of grief, even though it's really, really painful, because you're going to be uncovering all of your coping mechanisms and you're going to feel like naked and like terrified and pathetic. As you go through that process, the good news is all of that negative energy, all of that negative emotion that you're suppressing is actually going to like come out. It'll overwhelm you for a while, but then it'll actually start to subside. And then hopefully you'll have the space to take kind of the right steps forward. So unfortunately, this is something that we see very commonly. So this is a case of someone who's close to like a streamer or YouTuber or something like that, has something of a professional relationship, maybe a parasocial relationship. And it's really challenging because it's happening more and more and more. So like basically, how do you deal with, lusting over someone that you may not be able to have a relationship with? And it comes down to, first of all, being honest with yourself, because there may be more there than lust. And sometimes what our mind does is like tries to give us the most manageable version of our feelings. So it would be really, really hard for you to say, I'm in love with this person. So instead your mind is like, you're just horny. Don't worry about it. Just horniness. It's like a physical thing. It comes from the scrotum. No big deal. Next thing that you have to do is be careful about your resistance, because a lot of times in this situation, we know exactly what we need to do. But then our mind, since it really doesn't want to leave, will tell us, oh, you can't do what is good for you because of this reason. But the more that you look at that reason, the more you realize actually like you can do something about it, right? This person could try to apply for being an editor for like, they're like literally 10,000 streamers or YouTubers out there that are relatively successful, right? There's so many different platforms. There's Instagram, there's Facebook, there's YouTube, there's Twitch. And if you have a resume where you've helped this person, like, and you put on your resume, I started editing when this person was this big, now they're this big, I'm very professional, like I help people like succeed and put forward the best content, there will be people who will hire you. You just have to apply for enough jobs. But this person says, but I can't. So be careful about your internal resistance, because chances are there's a subconscious feeling that's driving you and telling you logically you can't leave because it doesn't want to leave. So it'll provide for you the best argument that it can to keep you there. Next thing to kind of think a little bit about is making sure that there's space in your life. So sometimes when we have these kind of relationships with people that are sort of like infatuations or lust or parasocial, the reason that we can't get free of them is because we don't have something else in our life to lean on. So, be a little bit careful about creating the space in your life so that you can kind of move from this unhealthy relationship to a healthy relationship. And a lot of times when we feel like an emptiness inside, we'll fill up that emptiness through our sense organs. So as long as you feel empty inside and you're editing these pictures, that's going to be like a really bad combination. The last thing you have to learn how to do is you have to learn how to mourn. You have to learn how to grieve and grieve this relationship, because there could have been something that was super awesome, right? Like if you like really sit down and think about the fantasy, how awesome would it be to be this person's editor and to be in a romantic relationship with her, right? To be like an integral part of their success, for y'all to be working together to create this brand. And how awesome would it be if like you guys like worked together and like had a personal relationship, right? There's a reason why a lot of people engage in personal relationships, like in the workplace. You have power couples. I'm speaking from kind of personal experience in terms of there are like a lot of advantages and a lot of attractive things about working with someone who you're engaged in a personal relationship with. I think 90% of the time it's a mess and usually unhealthy, but that doesn't make it any less attractive, right? It's so awesome to be in that 10%. So if you are in this kind of situation, my condolences. I think you also may want to think a little bit about working with someone to kind of work through these feelings, because it can be really hard to manage on your own. Your mind is a tricky, tricky thing. And so will do its best to keep you from understanding like what's actually going on, right? It's doing that to protect you. So working with a coach or working with, a therapist or something like that, even having like a long talk with someone that you can really confide in is really, really important. That's part of what I think is the advantage of like a coach or a therapist, is that, they're not invested in anything except for you, right? They're there for you. You can be honest with them about the deep and embarrassing thoughts. They may pick it up and may ask you questions that are like hard for you to like figure out on your own. So you can always do something like that. Make sense? Oh yeah, sorry, the notification is wrong for Squid Game. Is it good to address this with the streamer? I would say you shouldn't address things with the streamer yet, right? So when you it's a really good question. So like if I'm lusting over someone that at work, like what should I do? You should settle your own feelings first before talking to them. So you have to understand exactly what you feel, and you also have to understand the kind of position you're putting them in. I think that generally speaking, like honesty and authenticity is like a good thing to have, but you also have to recognize that like that may place a burden on someone else. And part of the reason there is that like the reason this is so bewildering for the other person is because you've constructed like you've spent 1,000 hours thinking about this, whereas like the streamer will have spent maybe 0. So when you kind of like present them with a conversation, they're going to feel like really shocked, and generally speaking, it's going to be hard for them to respond in a positive way. So, you're kind of like, it's hard to describe, but you're sort of like, you've got one leg up on them because you've been thinking about it for a long time and it may be like completely new to them. So I think a good example of this is I saw a post recently in the polyamory subreddit about, someone was kind of saying like, one partner had been like working with poly feelings for like 5 years. And then like the other partner, they'd been in a monogamous relationship. And so then like, the partner who thought they're poly was like, hey, this is how I feel, and then like a month later, they're like, so can we open up the relationship? And then like the other person was like, you've been thinking about this for 5 years. I've been processing it for 1 month. Like I need more time. And so you have to remember that you can do a lot of processing internally, but anytime you have a conversation with someone, you have to give them time to process. I do think in a perfect world, it's actually okay and maybe even professional to share with the streamer, why you're leaving. And when you ask for like a reference or something like that, you can say, hey, it's kind of weird, but like for some reason, like my mind is going into weird places about this relationship. It's not genuinely how I feel about you. And like, I respect you a lot as a professional colleague, and I'm just having trouble dealing with these things. I don't expect you to do anything about it. And I definitely don't want to put you in an awkward circumstance. So I think the best thing for me to do is actually leave. Like I'll help you find a replacement. Absolutely. I'd really appreciate a reference. I'm still like, I still care about you a lot as a professional colleague. I hope you do really well. But just for personal reasons, I think I have to, step away from this job. Is that cool? And just be like kind of professional about it and say like, hey, like it's just getting weird to be like editing your pictures all the time. So you can always have a conversation like that, but I'd say be careful about it. And then the other thing is that if you want to go for love, you can always confess your feelings and see what happens, but that's probably not going to end well. Okay, let's move on. So next thing that we're going to take a look at is therapy etiquette. So what are the unspoken rules of therapy? So this is a great question. And it looks like the post got deleted, but a lot of people will say like, go see a therapist. But then a lot of people are like kind of confused because they've never seen a therapist. They don't know how it works. And then they think like, oh, like I don't know how to do that because I've never done it before. And so that makes perfect sense because we're not really taught like what the rules of therapy are. So what we're going to try to do is I'm going to try to share a couple of like 4 basic points about, how to approach therapy. So the first is that it's not your responsibility to know what the rules of therapy are. So I know this is like a really challenging thing to understand, but when you go to the hospital, like let's say you go see your doctor, like let's say you get diagnosed with like cancer, okay? So heaven forbid. It's not your job to know like what to do. It's not even your job to like seek a diagnosis, right? So as medical doctors, like all you have to do is go see your doctor. And your doctor, it's their responsibility to like, check your body, check it for lumps, do a colonoscopy after you're 50 years old, like do a mammogram after a certain age. It's the expert's job to know what to do, right? So I think about like going to a car mechanic. Like you just go in and you say, hey, my car is making a weird noise. And then they're like, what kind of noise? And you're like, I don't know, a whoop, whoop. Like, you're not supposed to know. You're not supposed to know if it's a fan belt or a carburetor or like like an oil leak. You're not supposed to know anything. You're just supposed to show up and you're supposed to be like, here I am. Here's a basic direction for my problem. My car doesn't seem to be working right. You can just say that. So with a therapist, all you really need to come in with is like just a general reason. And it doesn't even have to be a good one. You can just say like, life is hard for me right now, right? And they're going to help you figure it out. So the first thing is that it's not your responsibility, like how to know, like how to be good in therapy. Like you can even go in and ask your therapist, how am I supposed to do this? I've never done this before. And like, we're all trained to help orient you to like how this works. So for example, anytime I see someone for the first time, I'll ask them, hey, have you ever been in therapy? Like, do you understand how this stuff works? And they'll be like, no. And I'd be like, hey, can I take a few minutes to explain it to you? And they'll be like, yeah, I'd really appreciate that, right? So that's like part of my opener as a therapist. If someone comes in, I understand that like most people don't know how this works. So I have to explain to them the rules of the game. So the first thing is you don't have to know. So you don't have to know really anything. You just show up with a general idea of what you're looking for. You can say, I feel depressed, or I'm lusting over a streamer, or like whatever. I don't know what's wrong with my life. I just feel like I'm stuck. Like all that kind of stuff is perfect. You just need like one sentence of generally speaking why you're coming. You can even go in and say, hey, I'm not even sure why I'm here, but like I've heard that a lot of people benefit from therapy, so I'm here to try it out. And like that's actually awesome. So then like the therapist knows, okay, cool, I know what I'm dealing with. They'll start to ask you questions and stuff like that. They'll take over, right? You just have to bring the car to the shop, and then the mechanic will figure out what they're supposed to do. So the second thing to understand is that therapy is not a passive process. So some people will say like, oh, if this is your problem, go to therapy. And so what some people will do is they'll like go to therapy and they'll be like, here I am, therapize me and fix it. But that's not actually how therapy works. So the success in therapy has to do with how much the patient is invested and how much the therapist is invested. So when you go to therapy, like expect to do the work. It's not your job to know what you're supposed to do, but you still have to do the work. So a lot of times people will say, I tried therapy and it didn't work for me. And oftentimes when I dig into those kinds of cases, I'll say like, what didn't work for you? And oftentimes what I'll run across, maybe like 30 to 40% of people are like very, very passive and don't actually like try to do anything. So the analogies I'd use here is like going to work with a personal trainer. So the personal trainer is the expert. Like you can walk up to a personal trainer and you can say, hey, I'm trying to get into shape. That's all you have to say. They'll figure out the how, right? It's not your job to understand like how these weights work or whether you should do cardio or whether you should do like, heavy weights or like low reps or high reps or body weight exercises or like parkour or like a decathlon. Like it's not your job to figure it out. It's their job to figure it out. But once they tell you what to do, you have to sit down and actually lift the weights. And so I'd say therapy is kind of the same way, where you can't just show up. It's not like a passive procedure like a biopsy or an x-ray where you just sit there and they do it to you. It's not like taking a pill where you just swallow and then like the antidepressant is going to work its magic. As a therapy, you have to be an active participant. And even if you say, I don't know how to do that, that's a great thing to ask your therapist. You can ask your therapist, hey, how am I being active enough? Like, should I be doing more? Like, how can I be a better patient in therapy? But generally speaking, don't assume it's a passive process. Understand that when you go in, the more you think, the more you share, and the more kind of vulnerable you are, for lack of a better term. You have to try, right? You have to persevere. You have to be patient. Those are all really important parts of therapy. So the third thing to understand is that in addition to trying, if it's not working, you need to bring it up with your therapist. This is probably the thing that is, if I were to pick one prognostic factor, so one factor that predicts success in therapy versus not success in therapy, it's the patient bringing up their concerns with the therapist. So as a therapist, we're not like mind readers, right? If you come in and you kind of like say, and I ask you, hey, how are things going? And you say like, everything is going well because you're trying to be polite, because you don't want your therapist to feel bad that their therapy is not helping you. So you're actually trying to protect them from feeling bad because, oh, it's not their fault, it's your fault because, you're so depressed that you're unhelpable. But you need to tell therapists if stuff isn't working. So you got to say, hey, I've been coming here for like a month or two, like I'm not really feeling a whole lot better. Can we talk about that? Like I feel like I come here every week and we talk about my feelings, but I actually am not seeing much change in my life. Like this is not what I was hoping for. I was hoping for more. And they may ask you, what were you hoping for? And then you may say, I'm not sure, but it isn't this, which is a completely acceptable answer. So then it is the therapist's responsibility. You may feel in that moment like, oh, how is this person supposed to help me if I don't even know what I want? And then you're going to feel ashamed of yourself and you're not going to want to share that. But it's absolutely the therapist's responsibility and your responsibility for the two of you to figure it out together. That's what therapy is about. It's a co-op game, right? So if someone, even if you don't understand like how to cook, like if you take a bite of something, you say it tastes off, and you're not the trained chef, and then the chef asks you like, how does it taste off? And you're like, I'm not sure. It just doesn't taste good. And then like the chef should start asking you questions, right? They should start like, oh, is it too salty? No. Okay, fine. Does it need some spice? No, the spice is fine. Oh, maybe like, how about some citrus? Like, let's try a little bit of citrus. And you're like, oh yeah, that's in the right direction. So you have to bring up your concerns with your therapist about it not working, okay? That's the third thing you've got to do. And the fourth thing is to remember that modalities of therapy are different. So therapy, much like food, has many different varieties, okay? So you've got like the third wave of therapies, which include like a lot of mindfulness. So this is like acceptance and commitment therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy. Then before that, kind of the second generation of therapy was like cognitive behavioral therapy. And so that tends to be a little bit more structured. Like sometimes you have worksheet and homework. It's worksheets and homework. Like it's like very like, first you do this, then you do this, then you do this. It's very systematic. And then like, way before that, you had like Freud and Jung who would do like psychoanalysis. So Freud would like have people lay down on a couch and he would sit behind them and wouldn't say anything for an hour. And then like they'd meet for like 1 hour a day. Like it was like a daily therapy thing where people are like free associating. So there are lots of different models of therapy. It's sort of like saying, I don't like video games. Like you may not like video games. You may not like FPS. You may like, MOBAs. You may not like MOBAs. You may like, chess. You may not like chess. You may like, Candy Crush or whatever. And so there are lots of different kinds of cuisines and lots of different types of therapy. So if something isn't working for you, you can also, try out something else or even bring that up with your therapist. In addition to the different modalities, there are different levels of activity. So one thing that I've observed is that a lot of people seem to like my style, which is a very like high activity style. So some people don't like it. Like some people will, think that they want me to like STFU. But so I think something is changing where like this generation, like the digital generation, is looking for more active therapists in my experience. So a lot of the older therapists who are a little bit more passive, who are a little bit like, let's just see where this goes. You can't rush therapy. It's going to take 6 months. It's going to take a year. It's going to take 2 years. It's going to take 3 years. I get bored and impatient. I'm like, there's a lot of impatience in some therapists. But I think that there's a lot of impatience with a lot of patients as well. But that's kind of like, I think that's okay. Whereas I think a lot of my colleagues like feel like that's a bad thing. And one of the most important things that you can teach in therapy is you have to teach a patient to be patient. I sort of disagree a little bit there. I think it's a little bit paternalistic. And it's like, oh, we have to teach you how it is because you don't know the truth. But so I think that remember that there's a lot of different modalities of therapy. There's a lot of different like types of therapists. So 2 CBT therapists may not be the same. I've worked with some CBT therapists that are very focused on the past. I've worked with some that kind of completely ignore the past. So there's a lot of different stuff to do. So remember, if you're kind of considering therapy and you don't know how to do it, the first thing to remember is that you're not expected how to do it. They're the expert, right? So that's what they're there for. They're there to help orient you. So just take your car to the mechanic and say it's making a weird sound. And then when they're like, then it's their job to figure it out. Second thing is to remember that it's an active process. So you can't just show up and like get yourself therapized. It's not like getting a cortisone shot, into a joint. It's not like taking an antibiotic pill or an antidepressant. You have to show up there, and the therapist is sort of like a personal trainer, or that's really what we kind of think of as coaches. The coach is a personal trainer for the mind. But at the end of the day, you're going to have to show up and do some of the work, right? Like ideally 50% of it. Third thing is if it isn't working for some reason, bring that up with them because that's something that you all have to problem solve together. And the fourth thing is to remember that not all therapists are the same and not all modalities are the same. So even if you don't, it's, just because you don't like French cuisine doesn't mean you don't like food. It's just that's one kind of cuisine, and there's Indian food, and there's sushi, and there's Thai food, and there's Nigerian cuisine. There's all these different kinds of cuisine. And so before you write off cuisine, food as a whole, try a couple of different things and then a couple of chefs within the cuisine, right? There are going to be different versions of sushi. There's the Americanized version of sushi, which is lots of different toppings and sauces and stuff like that. And there's the classic, sort of Japanese sushi, which is just fish or rice and fish with a little bit of wasabi or whatever. So there are different flavors of even an individual modality. So if you guys are thinking about therapy, definitely check it out. You don't have to know how to be good at therapy before you do it. And lean on your therapist to help show you the way. Questions? Yeah, so one person is saying, I never like typical therapy. Since I feel like talking to a wall, he will only listen to what I have to say passively. I agree with that. So I think this is where, I think it's tricky. I disagree with many of my colleagues where some of my colleagues will say that's the way it is done. I personally kind of disagree with that. I think that a lot of times, especially in the digital generation, in the generation of not calling the day before for a taxi, but picking up my phone and within 5 minutes having an Uber or Lyft in front of me, in the day of instant gratification and instant Google searches, back in the day, when therapy was developed, the idea was if you wanted to learn something, you had to travel to a library, find the book, open it up, and find the passage, right? Learning something you didn't know in Freud's time was at least a few hour endeavor, if not days, because sometimes you'd have to travel to a city to get access to a library. So now what's going on in society is that patients and people are getting are looking for quicker fixes. And so a lot of people in the therapy community will say that's not possible, but I actually kind of disagree. I do think it is possible to be faster, to be more active, and to help people in a quicker way. And I think it's kind of interesting because even the ideas of how long it takes to help someone in therapy were not designed through RCTs, right? I don't know if this makes sense, but it's not Sigmund Freud is I'm going to take 10 patients and with 5 of them, I'm going to see them 1 hour a week and I'm going to ask hard-hitting questions and look for progress. And with the other 5, I'm going to sit back and not say a damn thing. And he did a randomized controlled trial and he decided, actually sitting back and doing saying very little is superior to saying a lot. And so that's also why I think that things like coaching are on the rise, because something has happened where people seem to be unsatisfied with therapy. So coaching is rising, right? There's a growth, there's an explosion of coaching startups and coaching schools and coaching interventions. And why is that happening? I think it's because therapy for some reason is not meeting the needs that are evolving with people. If it was, if you just kind of think about it from kind of a market perspective, right? Why is this intervention growing? Why are more people going to coaching with each passing day as opposed to therapy? And it's because I think therapy is missing some things. And I suspect part of it is that coaches are very outcome focused, whereas therapists are not. So coaches will have limited engagement. So they'll say, we're going to work for you this time. This is what we're going to work on. We're going to design and plan actions. And therapists kind of don't do that. So I think there's something changing with people. And so, I think if the passive kind of therapy doesn't work for you, I think it's worthwhile to go see an active therapist. And you can even tell them, hey, my last therapist was kind of too quiet for me. I was just a little bit curious, how active are you and what's your kind of style of therapy? And try to look for someone who's a little bit more participatory. Or what about NLP therapy? So neuro-linguistic programming, I think, is a good example of something that's super cool in theory, but not very, my understanding based on the last time I checked the research was that it's not very actually effective. So neuro-linguistic programming is this idea that the way that we use our language correlates with how our brain functions. So people in NLP will say that if you start talking a certain way or use a particular kind of language, you will change your brain or potentially even influence other people's behavior. So the part of NLP that I think I personally find very correct is that the way that you feel in your brain or the way that you think in your brain will come out as language. But I don't sort of agree with some of the premise of some NLP practitioners, which is changing the way that you speak will like have as big of an effect on your beliefs. So for example, if you take an atheist and they repeat to themselves 5 times in the mirror every single day, I believe in God, I believe in God, I believe in God, I believe in God. Some people in NLP will say like that's how you change your mind, right? Like you start changing your language and you force yourself into a particular language and that will change your mind. Or you can take a theist and you can have them say, I'm an atheist, I'm an atheist, I'm an atheist, I'm an atheist. I don't think that's actually going to change their beliefs on God. So I think that actually changing you internally is not quite as simple as what some NLP say, what NLP people will say. I do believe, though, that from a diagnostic perspective, that people's words do track on to their beliefs. So that half they got right. I'm not quite as convinced about the kind of treatment perspective of NLP. Hey, Doc, how do you know if the narrative and thoughts about your life you've built in your head is reasonable? So this is the thing. The narrative in your head is always going to be reasonable. That doesn't mean it's right. Right? So this is something that y'all have to understand. So this is why I love the Vedic model of the mind. So Vedic psychology, I think it's like far simpler and more accessible than Western models of the mind. And the main reason for that is remember that the Western model of the mind was developed through conversation. So essentially what happened is like you had these people like Freud who were listening to the words of an external person. And based on the words of an external person, they started to hypothesize what was going on inside the mind. So that has some advantages. So the biggest advantage is that it's objective, right? You're not caught within your own mind, so you may not be influenced by your own bias. There's an argument against that as well. Whereas in the East, the yogis' understanding of the mind came a lot more from, or exclusively from internal observation, right? So they never had a conversation with anyone. They just sat there, closed their eyes, and were like looking at the function of their mind. So the downside there is that it's very subjective. So, but I think that this is where they kind of made an interesting discovery, which is that when you experience negative emotion, you have this thing called the ego, which rises up. And the ego is there to protect you from negative emotion. So anytime you feel hurt, your ego will arise and will like try to knock other people down or like pump yourself up. And then what the ego will do is go to your intellect or analytical reasoning and bully it. So once your ego is in control, and you guys may notice this, if you're like arguing with an egotistical person, you'll never be able to prove them wrong, right? They will twist logic however they need to support their viewpoint. And so this is just the nature of the ego. It's how it's like designed to function, which is that it doesn't like being wrong, and it'll come up with selective evidence to its point of view. So you'll see this anytime there's like a discussion, a non-com discussion between people of like differing political ideologies, right? Once the ego gets active, it's like both sides think that they're very logical and the other side is very idiot. It's just how it works. And so in that way, any narrative that you construct in your head, if it's rooted in ego or negative emotion, will seem very reasonable to you because that's just the way that your mind works. It's just not going to be correct, right? But it'll seem logical. It'll seem reasonable. Like people don't go around believing unreasonable things. Even anti-vaxxers, like they think they're being very reasonable. They've done their research, as they say, right? So like everyone thinks that the thoughts of their mind are very logical. Like that's just how the human mind works. Now they may not necessarily be correct. So what we try to do, so there's a lot more detail about this for people that are curious, by the way. So in Dr. K's Guide to Mental Health, we have like a video on Vedic psychology, which is quite long and explains the principle pretty well. Also gives you guys like, especially in the depression track, there's a lot of like practical application to, for example, people who have narratives of falling behind. Oh, I've fallen behind. Or, you know, these different kinds of narratives, of like where the maladaptive narratives come from and kind of how to deal with them. We also train our coaches some in Vedic psychology. So we take more of a, you know, they're not trained therapists. So we use like these different models. We use these Eastern models that I think are a little bit more accessible. So if you guys are interested in that stuff, like, you know, further information there. But the narrative in your head is always going to be reasonable. It's just not necessarily going to be correct. And so what we try to train our coaches to do is decompress the negative emotion in the ego. And that's what therapists do as well, right? So when therapists help you process your emotions, they're actually working along the same principle. They don't really conceptualize it that way, but once you process your negative emotions, then you no longer need the ego to protect you, and then your thinking becomes clear. Okay, let's do another one. We've got time for maybe one or two more. Okay. So next up, we've got, this is a good one. We've got things not to say to someone who confides their mental health struggles to you. Mental advice starter pack, okay? Let's take a look at this. It's not so bad, you have a great life. Hey man, the best antidepressant is being outdoors. Only Jesus can fill the emptiness inside your heart. Nothing is wrong. It's in your head. Stop whining and get over it. I have an amazing product for that. Do you know Sensi? Yeah, things are pretty bad for me too. Did I tell you about Sherry? So this is great because there are 6 bad responses to people who struggle with mental health. And this infographic is fantastic, or whatever, the meme, whatever, is great because it covers all 6 very beautifully, okay? So the first one is, it's not so bad, you have a great life. So this is a classic example of invalidation. So when you have mental health struggles and you talk to someone, you say hey, my life is hard. What they're going to do is they're actually going to try to reassure you, right? So our instinct is to actually reassure people who are struggling and tell them, if I just got broken up with and I think I'm going to be alone for the rest of my life, and I say, I'm going to be alone, I'm never going to find love. And people will say oh no, you will find love, it'll be great, there are so many fish in the sea, think positive, man. And there's some utility to that. But oftentimes people will say something like this, it's not so bad, you have such a great life, what are you complaining about? So this is incredibly invalidating. So the first thing that people will do when someone is struggling with their mental health is to invalidate their feelings. So the next thing that people will do is kind of this sort of wellness signaling, for lack of a better term. So there are some people who are almost anti-psychiatry or super into wellness and yoga and stuff like that. And don't get me wrong, I'm a big fan of wellness and yoga and all that kind of stuff. It's a huge part of what I do. It's I studied complementary alternative medicine for a decade. But we have to be really careful about this sort of wellness, sort of virtue signaling stuff. Hey man, the best antidepressant is being outdoors. And there's data to support this, right? So there's data that suggests that, for example, plant aerosols have positive effects on mood and anxiety. So we know that literally the phytochemicals that are secreted by plants have positive effects on our mood. But that doesn't mean that the best antidepressant is being outdoors. It's possible that the best antidepressant is an actual antidepressant and that being outdoors kind of helps. So you got to be careful about sort of the wellness response to mental health problems. Because this too is incredibly invalidating. It's this person is looking at you and saying hey, all you have to do is go outdoors and then your problems will be fixed. I think it speaks to a huge amount of ignorance to the depth of how much some people struggle. Right? I've worked with patients with schizophrenia and addictions and bipolar disorder and stuff like that. And does going for a walk every day help their mental health? Absolutely. Is it a piece of the puzzle? Absolutely. But it's not you just need to go outside more and then you're suddenly cured of your bipolar disorder. I haven't seen that anyway. So I think, wellness signaling is the second thing that you just really have to be careful of, because it, once again, is invalidating, and they're just it's easy, bro. Just go for a walk. And there's, once again, good evidence that going for a walk will help. We know, for example, that vitamin D deficiency is one of the causes of depressive episodes. So we know that sunlight and even using some of these artificial sunlight machines and stuff in the wintertime or in climates like Scandinavia where there's very low light can actually have protective effects against depression. So there's some truth to this, but we have to be really careful about placing this artificial value on wellness and nature and that kind of thing, and kind of remember and acknowledge that for some people, being outdoors is the best antidepressant because they don't have, true major depressive disorder or bipolar disorder. They just may have a little bit of seasonal affective disorder, a little bit of feeling cooped up. So there's some truth to it, but we have to be really careful about wellness signaling. The next thing is only Jesus can fill the emptiness inside your heart. So this is what I would call imposing values. So when some people struggle with mental health issues and they try to like talk to other people, what the other person will do is like won't acknowledge at all what your actual struggle is and will just impose their values on you. And religion is like the number one thing, where they'll sort of say like, oh, just pray more, or Jesus can fill the emptiness in your heart, or you just need to meditate, right? Or like, just go to the temple, like just like do like religious kind of stuff, or do the things that I value and I care about, or the things that helped me. They don't acknowledge at all that their brain may be different, that their experience of may be different, that, you know, the benefit that they've gained from religion may be different from the benefit that you can gain from religion. Much like different kinds of cuisine, there are lots of different religions, and it's not like a one-size-fits-all sort of thing. If it was a one-size-fits-all kind of thing, I think we'd have like one dominant religion in the world, and like it would have been there for thousands of years. So human beings are different, and if someone is coming to you for support, remember that what worked for you or your value system may not actually apply to the other person. The next thing that they do is this kind of thing. Nothing is wrong. It's in your head. Stop whining and get over it. So this is victim blaming, right? So like when some people don't understand mental illness, they will oftentimes blame the people who are ill. And so they'll just say things like, oh, you know, nothing is wrong. It's in your head. Stop whining and get over it. This is such a perfect example. So I've heard about, you know, kids that parents do this and they'll say like, oh, it's not really that big of a problem. It's in your head. This really sad thing is that a lot of people who say this are actually exhibiting a psychological defense mechanism called reaction formation, where they start to hate the things that they see in themselves. So a good example of this is people who are homosexual who are also homophobic. So sometimes, you know, I remember kind of seeing this sort of thing in East Texas, where East Texas is a pretty religious kind of place. And so some people would be gay, but they'd grow up in a predominantly Christian society where like they would feel really, really guilty for being like homosexual. So they'd start to hate themselves. And as a result, they would like hate homosexuality and they'd become homophobic, and they'd start to hate other people who are homophobic. And so a lot of times it's really sad, but people who will, you know, victim blame are actually projecting their own self-hatred. So when you feel, and you guys if you guys have experienced like ADHD or depression, you'll actually understand this, because, you know, when you have ADHD, you feel so ashamed and incompetent yourself. And you'll say like, I don't understand what's wrong with me. There's nothing wrong with me. I'm just an idiot. I need to just get over it. I just need to get out of bed and just work. I just need to do this. Why am I so incompetent? I can't do it. I can't do it. I just need to stop whining and just grow up and be able to actually function like a normal human being. So there's a lot of that self-hatred. I think it's actually beautiful here that they picked someone who's a little bit older, because as that self-dialogue grows and grows and grows in your head, and then when you see someone else who actually like vocalizes their feelings, all of that self-hatred comes pouring out, and then you end up victim blaming. The next thing that people will do is problem solve. So I have an amazing product for that. Do you know Sensi? So this is great, because like when some people are struggling with their mental health and you go to someone else for support, what they'll try to do is fix it for you. They'll be like, oh, I can fix it for you. Just do this, right? Use this product, or just use a light, or here's a weighted blanket. And all those things can help. You know, there's some very limited evidence that aromatherapy can be like, you know, beneficial for mood. But a lot of times people who, you know, when you're kind of struggling, people will just assume that if you just like use this product or do this one thing, then it's like easy, done, finished. Just do this thing and like your problem will be fixed. And so if I'm alone and have trouble like finding a partner, people will just be like, oh, just go ask out like 100 people. Like, it's fine. Just get on Tinder and just ask out 100 people. So they'll sort of problem solve for you. This is also something that we see a lot in male-female relationships, where a lot of times women that I've worked with will like be looking for emotional support, and what they get from their male partners is like problem solving. And so a big thing that we'll train, especially in group coaching, is how to take a step back from problem solving and how to be an active listener and help someone like explore their own feelings, so that once you have a shared understanding of the problem, then when you present a problem solving solution, it can actually be helpful. But early on, you know, giving someone an answer to their problems is usually not very helpful, because most people are pretty smart. Most people like know what they should do, right? We had a post earlier today about, you know, what someone needs to do is change their job so they stop lusting after a streamer. But getting to that point, like knowing what to do is not the hard part. it's actually doing it. So a lot of people in our community know that, for example, they need to eat healthier, or know that they need to exercise more, or know that they need to apply for a different kind of job, or know that they need to, go back to college or apply for colleges or whatever. They know they need to work on their resume. So problem solving when these people are struggling, come to you with a struggle, doesn't actually help. The last thing, this one in particular is so bad with social media. So monopolizing suffering. So like sometimes when you're suffering, you'll reach out to someone for support, right? You'll say like, oh yeah, things are rough for me. And then the other person will be like, yeah, things are pretty bad for me too. Did I tell you about Sherry? So what they'll actually do is end up monopolizing the suffering. So you'll see this, I've seen some of this happen really toxically in like trauma support groups, where, one person will have trauma and then like other people will do this like one-upping of the trauma. So one person will be like, yeah, my parents yelled at me. And then like someone else will be like, oh yeah, like my parents hit me. And then the third person will be like, oh yeah, well like my parents sexually abused me. And so what happens is like, instead of actually being compassionate and listening to someone else, we engage in this kind of like, oh, I can relate to you too. Let me tell you about my problems. And in the head of this person, they're thinking, oh, let me try to relate to them. Like, let me try to show them that I understand by talking about myself. But if you want to understand someone, you shouldn't do it by talking about yourself. You should do it by listening to them. So watch out for people who are monopolizing suffering. Watch out if you yourself are someone who tries to help people understand that you know where they're coming from because of your experience. Because the truth is that you may have had one experience, but if you really think about it, your experience, if anything, is more likely to give you a false understanding of their experience, because you had this one experience and they may have a completely different experience. So be careful about monopolizing suffering. And it certainly doesn't help for the person who's trying to open up to you, right? And so it's really sad, but I think that as conversations about mental health are increasing, what I've seen more and more is like these 6 bad responses to mental health conversations. Like when you open up to someone, people will do 6 things. They'll invalidate you. They'll sort of like do some kind of like wellness signaling. They'll impose their values on you. They'll do a lot of victim blaming, which is oftentimes like a projection of their own self-hatred. They'll do problem solving and they'll monopolize the suffering. So don't do that, chat. It's not good for you. Questions? Yeah, so one person saying, my friend tried to share his problem. I think I did 5 to 6 of these. You should remind chat that it's really, really hard to be truly compassionate and reflectively listen. Great point, Lord Meow. So this is the thing. So not responding in these 6 ways is actually a skill that has to be trained. So 100 years ago, I don't know that people needed these skills. I don't know that people confided in each other. I don't know that mental health was as bad as it is. As a society, we've ascended in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? So for the most of us, thankfully, like food and shelter and clothing are like more secure than they've really ever been in the history of humanity. I'm not saying that everyone has it easy. We still have a homelessness problem. We have a huge wealth inequality problem. Some people unfortunately like are going hungry, and that's really bad. But generally speaking, like compared to, let's say 100 years ago, all of those problems were worse. So what's happened as we've gained security, as we've gained shelter, as we've gained food, as survival has become less of an issue, mental problems are actually on the rise. And as those mental problems are on the rise, we as human beings, as a society, we haven't adapted to that yet, right? So we didn't need to know how to reflectively listen like 100 years ago. So now what's happening is that we've got all these instincts where we try to help people. So a lot of these 6 bad responses to mental health are in efforts to help. But unfortunately, we're just not like well trained, right? So this is where like at Healthy Gamer, one of the big things that we try to do is train people in how to do these things. So if you yourself do these things, that's actually completely understandable and in a sense completely forgivable, because there's no class in school about how to listen to another human being. They'll teach you mathematics, they'll teach you science, they'll teach you history, they'll teach you like literature, but they won't teach you how to be active listeners. So this is really fascinating, but they actually did a study. I can't pull up the reference right now, but they did a study, I think, with 12,000 students, maybe in New York, where they split the 12,000 students into 2 cohorts of 6,000. and half of the students got taught social and emotional skills as a class, and the other half just had a normal curriculum. And what they found is that the kids who were taught social and emotional skills scored on average like 11% higher than the kids who didn't know social and emotional skills. And that's like across the board in all of their like classes. So even like their history tests and math tests were like 11 points higher on average. That's crazy. So this actually speaks to a deficiency in our education and our learning. And so it's challenging because in personal coaching, we can't really teach that. So what we try to do, so we had a communication seminar, a communication webinar like over a year ago that you guys can check out on YouTube, where I sort of explained some of these principles. A couple weeks ago, I did a quick lecture about how to convince anyone of anything. So how to like, how the process of like listening, understanding, and convincing actually works. A lot of that also has to do with the Jimmy from Philly kind of episode, because a lot of people were like really surprised by how that interview went. And the reason it went the way that it did and it went so well is because like you can train yourself in how to talk to people. And the last thing is that these are things that ultimately we have to teach in group coaching. So group coaching is about understanding and helping people like explore like themselves and like learning how to support each other. So these are actually explicit skills that we'll teach in group coaching so that you guys can like learn, because that's just how it works. And as you become a strong listener, as you stop giving into these sort of reflexive answers of how to support people with their struggles, it actually turns out that you will be like a better friend, a better partner, a better work colleague. I also teach this stuff in esports. It works out really well. Yeah, it's like leveling up your speech, right? That's basically what it's like. So how to level up your speech. And all these responses that they showed were like bad speech videos. Have you done any follow-up with the Philly guy? Did any of it stick or did he go back? I don't know about whether it stopped. Generally speaking, we don't really follow up with people. So, our videos are really for educational purposes only. And I did get a couple of super nice DMs from Jimmy. He says he's doing well. He appreciates it. I think even like his fans really appreciated the interview. So I think he was very happy with, how he was portrayed and how he came off, which I think makes perfect sense because I think he's a good dude. I know it's kind of weird, Chad. I'm going to say something kind of weird. I think most people out there are like decent human beings, even the ones that get hated on the internet. I think the problem with the internet is that, with things like Twitter and stuff like that, with 160 characters, all you can do is judge. You can't understand through Twitter, right? It's just not a platform that's designed for understanding. It's a platform that's designed to like emotionally evoke things, spread information, and like induces a lot of judgment. I don't know that that's what they were trying to do when they designed it. I think they were just, trying to create brief communication. But the internet is so judgment prone and so little like understanding prone. And so it turns out that, most people, like some people would ask like, how am I able to talk to someone like that? It's because like, I really do believe that most human beings are like genuinely good people, like 99% of them. And that if someone is not behaving in a good way, there's like a good reason for that. You have to give people the benefit of the doubt. And I'm even thinking about the LS stream. So like LS is a good example of, he shared this story where like he was like acting out, right? And everyone was quick to punish him. And there was one teacher who was like, no one has asked why he's doing this, right? No one cares why you're doing the things that they're doing. All they want to do is blame you for what you do. So this is also something I've learned a lot as an addiction psychiatrist. Like everyone's quick to blame you for your addiction. And do you have some degree of personal responsibility over it? Absolutely. But the blame sort of doesn't help, right? Like the judgment sort of doesn't, it can help. So I'll judge people. So we don't teach our coaches to be non-judgmental. It's a very subtle thing. But the values that we live by at Healthy Gamer are 3: authenticity, compassion, and presence. Not politeness, not non-judgmentalness. So it's my belief that you should hold people accountable and it's okay to judge, but do so with compassion, right? Like if someone is screwing up in their life and not living up to their responsibilities, you want to acknowledge that and you want to say, hey man, I know you can do better. I want to help you do better, but you do it with compassion. You don't be like polite and say like, oh, it's not your fault. Like, some people do. I don't. So, oh, it's like not your fault. Like, oh, like everything is like, oh, you have no, like, oh, you're ill. Like, oh, it's a really hard balance to walk. But I'll just kind of think about, my patients, for example, with bipolar disorder, where it's like, I don't blame them for what they do when they're manic, but I do blame them for stopping to go on their medication without any kind of discussion or plan. Right? And this is the really tricky thing about mental illness. Should we give people excuses? Like, absolutely. We have to account that this person's brain is not working for them. They're genuinely living life like with an additional, handicap. And so they have to account, but like at the same time, you can still empower them, right? You can still give them agency, and you can say to someone, it's just my experience as a psychiatrist, treating people with mental illness like victims helps only up to a point. And then at some point, you have to start empowering people. You have to help people understand that, yeah, do you have PTSD? Does it suck for you? Absolutely. Like, is it your fault? Absolutely not. Is your life genuinely harder than the average person? Absolutely. Do you deserve help for that? Absolutely. Do you deserve compassion for that? Absolutely. But you also have some degree of control, right? It's your choice whether you can go to therapy or not go to therapy, or whether you drop out or don't drop out. You have some control here. And as a human being, you don't necessarily control your circumstances, but you do control how you act and how you respond to your circumstances. So what I kind of like, the people that the patients that I have that are very successful with bipolar disorder, for example, are the ones that do the work to like stay on the medication, or at least have conversations about going off of medication. Even 30 to 40% of people that I have that have bad bipolar disorder, we can get off of medication. It's just about having a plan in place when you do it, right? It's like, so one person, for example, used to visit, they had children, and one of their kids lived across the world. So sleep disturbance and not having a good sleep schedule is one of the worst triggers for bipolar disorder. So when I was talking to this person, we developed a plan. They're like, I really don't want to be on the medication anymore. It really makes it hard for me to make art. And I was like, that's totally fine. So like, what are the risk factors? Let's think through it. What are the risk factors? Okay, if I eat well and I sleep well, it should be fine. So we started tapering off the medication. They stuck to their schedule. The medication came down. 2 months later, they're totally fine. Medication came down. 2 months later, they're totally fine. 2 months later, medication off, they're totally fine. What are the risk factors? Oh, like if I visit my kid and like I get jet lagged, oh, that's a risk factor. Okay, so you've got one of two choices. Either you stop visiting your kid, or when you visit your kid, you should think about starting medication for a short period of time, get a certain level of it, and then you're there for you take it for the duration of your trip, and then you come back and we can kind of taper you off. So you can do things like that, but you have to work at it. You have to accept responsibility. You have to recognize that you as a human being have the power to influence your mental illness. So it's tricky, but I think that you have to acknowledge that you've got this. I kind of went off on a tangent here, but first of all, when it comes to like dealing with your mental illness, you have to acknowledge that, like, yes, you deserve compassion. Yes, you deserve support. Yes, things are not easy for you, but don't take it laying down, right? There are things that you can do. Even if it's hard, like, let's work on it. I don't blame you if you set a goal to, like, start exercising and you're not able to do it because of your depression, like, no big deal. But come in next week and, like, let's talk about it and let's work on it. Even if you come in next week and you say, hey, it's really hard for me to, like, come in today, or let's say you cancel and you say, like, I'm just really in the pits, like, I want to cancel my appointment this week or next week. It's like, totally fine, dude. Like, let's schedule a 5-minute phone call next week and just check in. And when you're ready to do the work, like, come on back. And there are people that, because of their depression, they can't come into appointments, which is fine. When the depression is too bad, like, you accept that, right? You treat it with authenticity and compassion. But the second you get the chance, you come on back and we're going to, like, work at it again. And success against mental illness is not, like, it's not binary. It's a process of working at it and then, like, failing and working at it and failing and working at it and failing. And then eventually a year or two in, if you really put your mind to it, despite the depression, despite the bipolar disorder, despite the anxiety, even with things like borderline personality disorder or narcissistic situations, people with ADHD, you can make a lot of progress with the right kind of support and the right kind of mindset. And even if you have the wrong kind of mindset, ask for help and get someone else's help to change your mindset. That's where it all starts. Asking for help is OP. Yeah, so Blake said it beautifully. Mental illness isn't your fault, but it is your responsibility. That's a great way to put it. Beautiful way to put it. Okay, so so Remuldos is asking, where is the line and when I should get help? I know we should decide on therapy when we can't stop our problems from messing with our life responsibilities, but if it doesn't happen, although you are getting worse, when should you go to therapy? Could it be too late sometimes before something serious will happen? When you should go to therapy is almost, the right answer to that question is almost always now. So therapy is like, doesn't have to be used after a particular threshold. So like I have therapy patients who don't have like diagnoses, right? They're in complete remission. So I'll give you guys like just a quick story. So I had one patient who came in who had narcissistic personality disorder, and we like worked together for 2 years. Like he had really bad trauma, didn't really have PTSD. So the diagnostic criteria for PTSD is like different. It's like nightmares and flashbacks and stuff like that. But he grew up in such a toxic household that like, and his parents were so narcissistic that that's just how he learned how to function. So when he was like learning about human interactions from his parents, he just learned that this is how you behave, right? So he got wired that way. Caused a lot of problems with his work and stuff like that, ended up coming to my office. We worked together for a couple of years, and then he like no longer met criteria for narcissistic personality disorder. So he was like functioning well, like did well at work, stuff like that. Relationships are still, going way better than they used to. He had a bad habit of dating people with BPD, so he stopped doing that, which was good. And then like, but there's still a lot of work to do, right? So then he like decided like, okay, even though I no longer like meet criteria for this mental illness, like I want to continue working on myself and improving myself, and you can do that through therapy. So if someone's asking like, where's the line? There isn't one. Like you can always go to therapy and get some help. And I think part of the problem is that our society is changing, like I mentioned earlier, and a greater amount of things that make our life bad are mental in nature. So go to therapy, irrespective of whether you think you have a diagnosis or whether you think you need it. Chances are it'll help. And if it doesn't help, like no big deal, right? At least you went in and you got checked out and you see like that you don't need it. But you can't decide. It's very hard for you to decide unless you're a trained therapist, and even then it's hard, right? Because there are all kinds of subjective biases. So it's sort of like go and get help, and then just like get the help. Right? Like life doesn't have to be lived without assistance. Like go get help. It's a co-op game. It's like a persistent multiplayer universe. So go and take advantage of the people out there who can help you. You don't have to play solo. This is kind of interesting. And Broxane is saying, I'm a psychologist but had little to no benefit from therapy myself for anxiety and depression. Although I know the literature supports efficacy over placebo, my experience creates an internal conflict within me when thinking of exercising the profession of a therapist. I'm considering changing career path because of this, and I feel lost. So I think this is great. So, I mean, not that you're in the situation. The situation's unfortunate, bro. But I think this is a great example. Also, you may not be a bro. I think this is a great example of like, it's that internal conflict that you've got to potentially work through with a therapist, right? So I don't know if you ever did that. But going to a therapist and saying, hey, I'm not sure if this is working, even though I'm a psychologist. Like, I don't know exactly what to do about that. It's working through that internal conflict, which will absolutely be the right thing, right? Because as long as that internal conflict is there, like you're not going to benefit from therapy. That's the first thing you need to go to. Okay. Yeah, so but why do I want to play solo so much? Because when you're playing solo, no one has to see your failures. That's why we love playing solo, right? So you guys ever do this thing where like, if you know, like if you're going to a LAN party and you haven't played a game, that you like practice it first before the LAN party so you don't get owned? If you do that, then you know why you play solo. It's one thing to be a failure. It's another thing to advertise it. And that's the big trick, right? That's the tricky thing. That's the paradox of life. Is that if you want to stop being a failure, the first step is advertising it. That's how you get help. And help is OP. Like, just think about this for a second, chat. Think about this. There are people out there who are better at this than you are. And you can try to learn it yourself the hard way, but like you can just like go and get help and they'll tell you how to do it. People are there to help you. People love helping you. Like, think about you, like you love helping other people. Y'all are great. But it's devastating, but remaining a failure is more, how can I say this? For most people, they would rather remain a hidden failure than advertise being a failure and no longer being a failure. We'll choose hidden failure over public success any day of the week. And that's one of the most devastating things about being human. And I think our current like internet-based environment only exacerbates that. So let go of ego, meditate, you know, and let yourself suck. Like, that's okay. Like, this is the other problem that happens is we identify with sucking, right? So we don't say to ourselves, like, we don't think about ourselves as inexperienced. All we see is our performance. So like we attribute our failures not to a lack of inexperience, but to personality issues. So we say like, oh, like I am lazy or I'm an idiot or like other people are successful. We use these be verbs, are, am. I am this way. I am a failure. I am an incel. It's an identification with a thing. You know, I am like, we don't say I just haven't had a girlfriend yet. Like that's not what we say. I haven't had is like very different. Like we identify with the thing. And if you look at research on psychedelics and meditation, the method through which psychedelics and meditation seem to work is they change your perception of identity. So they change the identification that you have with a particular condition. So people who will use psychedelics, like the ones that use it in a therapeutic environment and the ones that have good experiences, will say things like, I realize that I am not a failure. Like what I am is different from a failure. Like, and so then they separate that out. Therapy can do that. Meditation can do that. You have to divorce yourself from like the outcomes of your actions. And when you start defining yourself as a failure, that's when you're screwed, right? Because then all kinds of like subconscious calculations change. And I've come to appreciate over the last couple of weeks, like the value of subconscious calculations. And your mind is like constantly calculating about what you can do and what you can't do. And if you perceive yourself as a failure, you're kind of screwed there. Yeah, so Gravy Boat is saying a bad trip on LSD is as helpful as a good one. You still learn about yourself, albeit it's chaos. So that's where I'd say that you're lucky. So I've worked with, unfortunately, too many people who have had bad trips that have like basically permanently disabled them. So I've had people who have like PTSD from LSD trips and they're like not able to hold jobs. One person described it to me as permanent anxiety, like this, so they feel anxious like constantly, and like I really couldn't help them. I tried. I just didn't, it was just weird. Like I couldn't find any like root to their anxiety or whatever. It's weird. So I wouldn't really advocate substance use, especially psychedelics. It's just, you're playing with fire. So that's also true of like advanced meditation techniques. So like my teachers told me, for example, that, you know, some techniques that I was taught, like I shouldn't do unless I was like with them and like out in the woods. So deep meditation techniques, the ones that are a little bit more like hallucinatory, have been described to me as playing with fire. So even like the Kundalini Shakti is like viewed as fire that can like consume you. So it can burn away like all of your negative karmas, or it can burn away everything. So those practices need to be done with a lot of care and caution. Holotropic breathwork is a good example of a very surface level practice that is in that vein. So psychedelics in a clinical setting may be better, and that's where the studies we need to kind of find out. Yeah, you talked about bacteria in our guts impacting mental health. Can you reference how we can know what to eat? Yeah, there's a whole section on that in the Guide to Mental Health, which is exactly why we built it, because it is very like complicated and in-depth. So there are like charts and stuff, like PDFs that go with the guide that sort of break down what you should eat. And it's complex. It's like a whole, I mean, people have written books about it. People have researched gut-brain mental health for like 20 years. So it's not like an easy, like, this is what you eat. It's all very diagnostic. So what you should eat depends on like what's going on. So who should we raid? I got to run. Between stomach and brain, what? Oh yeah, so even people are asking, is this something to do with stomach and brain? Yeah, so there's one of the things, there's a video about the mechanism of gut-brain interactions. So there are 4 major pieces. It's all in the guide. I just got here, Sag. I'm sorry, dude. We're gonna try to raid. I'll pop up here and there. Sing Sing? Trainwreck? Pokey? Is Pokimane streaming right now? Isn't it late? We'll raid Pokimane if she's streaming. She's streaming? Chat? Dude, what time is it? No, she's not streaming. What are you guys talking about? She's not live. Offline, dude. You guys are trolling. Cancel. Trainwrecks? Okay, let's raid. Soda or Trainwrecks? Train? Let's raid with Trainwrecks. TV. Okay. Train is streaming, right, dude? He should be up this late. Okay. Dude, late night degeneracy. Just our so take care, chat. I'll try to pop up maybe in a couple days. I don't know. GG.